The key card died in my hand. Julian stood on the other side of the glass, smirking in my signature suit. My suit. Security closed in, their hands flexing like they'd been paid to break more than rules. I swung the briefcase, felt it crack against a jaw, and ran. The elevator doors hissed shut just as the first boot hit metal. 4 hours until the horizon pitch. My backup drive was encrypted. And Sarah? She'd already changed the locks. The gym locker was empty. My last play, the drive hummed in my palm, useless. Because the woman who handed me my first promotion had just signed my termination. The revolving door spat Arthur Vance into the lobby's pressurized silence. Polished marble stretched toward the elevators, smelling of expensive citrus wax and filtered air. He reached into the pocket of his charcoal suit, the one he always wore on the 14th of the month, and pressed his key card against the reader. Instead of the familiar, welcoming chirp, a dull red light pulsed like a warning. A low electronic buzz vibrated through his fingertips, a rejection that felt personal. He tried again, swiping the plastic with a sharp, rhythmic jerk, but the turnstile remained locked. It was a chrome barrier cutting him off from the world he had spent 30 years building. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass of the executive suite, Julian Reed stood by the mahogany credenza. Julian was younger, sharper, wearing a suit that was a near-perfect mimicry of Arthur's own style. He tilted his head, a slow, practiced smirk spreading across his face as he raised a crystal tumbler. The ice clinked. A tiny, mocking sound, muffled by the soundproof barrier. Julian mouthed a single word, his lips curling around the syllables, though the glass stayed between them like a cage. Arthur didn't need to hear the sound to know it was a goodbye. Arthur's grip tightened on his briefcase handle. The leather groaned under the pressure. A group of junior associates scurried past, their hushed whispers bouncing off the high ceilings like the chirping of startled birds. They avoided his eyes, drifting toward the freight entrance, sensing the shift in power before it had even been announced. The air in the lobby felt thin, oxygen-deprived. Arthur straightened his tie, feeling the silk pinch his throat. He looked at the turnstile again, his reflection caught in the polished metal. A man who had designed the very logos on the walls, now being treated like a trespasser in his own cathedral. Problem, Mr. Vance? Christopher Brown, the head of security, approached with a gait that was too wide, too stable. His boots clicked rhythmically on the stone, a sound that echoed military precision. He didn't reach for the heavy flashlight on his belt, but he planted his feet in a way that blocked the path to the reception desk. Christopher never sat with his back to the door. Even now, his eyes flicked toward the street entrance, scanning for exits. A glitch, Christopher. My card isn't responding, Arthur said, his voice maintaining the measured, structural integrity of a man who believed precision was a prerequisite for life. Orders came down at 6, Christopher said, his voice flat and devoid of the respect he'd shown for the last 5 years. He gestured toward the street, where the Michigan Avenue traffic roared in a chaotic, metallic flood. Your belongings are being couriered to your home address. Please exit the building, sir. Arthur felt a cold prickle of sweat at his hairline. High above, Julian tilted the glass again, draining the amber liquid before turning his shoulder to the window. The light caught the gold of Julian's watch, a gift Arthur had given him when he'd promoted the boy to creative lead. The betrayal wasn't just a corporate maneuver. It was a theft of identity. I have the horizon pitch in 4 hours, Arthur said, his fingers twitching toward his shirt tag, checking the number. It was 14. The symmetry was breaking. I need to speak with Sarah. Ms. Johnson is unavailable, Christopher replied, stepping closer. The smell of the guard's peppermint gum was overpowering, a sharp, artificial scent that didn't belong in this marble tomb. "I have my orders. Move along." Arthur backed away, the revolving door catching him and sweeping him back out into the Chicago wind. The cold bit into his face, a bone-deep freeze that turned the exhaust-heavy air into a gray mist. He stood on the sidewalk, a lone island in a river of gray-suited commuters who moved with fixed, unblinking eyes. He felt the weight of the briefcase in his hand, the only thing he had left. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He wasn't just being sidelined, he was being erased. He looked up at the towering glass of the office, where the flickering fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in a rhythmic, mocking beat. He had to get back in. He had to reach the gym locker where he kept the encrypted drive, the only physical evidence of the Horizon Project's true soul. As he turned to find a side entrance, two men in dark, tactical jackets stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. They didn't look like office workers. They looked like predators. They moved in perfect synchronization, their boots heavy on the salt-stained pavement. "Mr. Vance?" the taller one said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Arthur's chest. "We're here to ensure you find your way home safely." They weren't security. They were mercenaries. Sarah had hired Muscle to make sure he didn't just leave, but disappeared. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm that threatened his composure. He looked at the service entrance 20 feet away. He had built this firm on the idea that every brand needs a foundation. Right now, his foundation was crumbling, and the only way to save it was to fight. The taller guard reached out, his hand a thick, calloused slab of meat aimed for Arthur's shoulder. Arthur didn't think. He reacted with the precision of a man who spent his life aligning objects. He swung the vintage briefcase, a heavy, leather-bound box filled with brass-edged portfolios. It connected with the guard's forearm with a dull, sickening thud. The guard grunted, the sound lost in the roar of a passing city bus. Arthur didn't wait to see the damage. He lunged for the service door, his fingers fumbling for the heavy iron handle. It was heavy, slick with the greasy residue of the city's soot. He pulled, his muscles screaming, and slipped inside just as a second hand caught the fabric of his coat. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the narrow service corridor like a gunshot. The air inside smelled of old copper and wet cardboard. It was a stark contrast to the citrus-waxed lobby. Arthur leaned against the cold brick wall, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He was in the bowels of the building now, a place of pipes and humming machinery. He had to reach the 4th floor, the executive gym. He found the service elevator, a cage of scarred steel that groaned as it descended. The floor indicator was a physical dial that skipped the number 4, jumping from 3 to 5. Arthur felt a surge of nausea. He pressed the button for the 5th floor, his mind racing. He would have to take the stairs back down. The elevator climbed with a high-pitched mechanical whine that rattled his teeth. It felt like the walls were closing in, the galvanized steel slick with a film of oil. When the doors scraped open, he was met with the silence of the 5th floor hallway, a vacuum of sound that made his own heartbeat sound like a drum. He slipped into the stairwell, his leather soles clicking softly on the concrete. He reached the 4th floor and pushed through the heavy fire door. The gym was empty, the air chilled to exactly 55 degrees. Every treadmill was running at maximum speed, their belts whirring in a ghostly, frantic race to nowhere. Arthur moved toward his private locker. His hands were shaking, a deviation he couldn't control. He spun the dial, left, right, left, and the metal door creaked open. Tucked behind a stack of identical white shirts was a small black drive. It felt cold, like a piece of ice in his palm. This was it. The Horizon Project. The culmination of his life's work. He pulled a laptop from his briefcase and plugged the drive in. He needed to see the files, to ensure the ethical safeguards he'd spent years perfecting were still intact. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over his face. Subverted beat 1.4. Arthur's fingers flew across the keys. He had designed the encryption himself, a complex series of metaphors and visual keys that no one else should be able to break. It was a masterwork of digital architecture, a fortress built to protect the data of millions. He felt a surge of pride, a brief moment of warmth in the freezing gym. "Almost there," he whispered, his shoulders dropping an inch as the progress bar climbed. The bar hit 100%. A green checkmark appeared. Arthur exhaled, a long, shaky breath of relief. He had the proof. He could go to the board, show them that Julian was a fraud, and reclaim his seat. The system was opening. The doors were unlocking. He could almost taste the victory. It tasted like the expensive scotch he kept in his desk. Then the screen blinked. The green checkmark vanished, replaced by a pulsing yellow cursor. A new prompt appeared, one he hadn't programmed. Secondary authentication required. Arthur frowned. He tried his backup phrase. Rejected. He tried the date of his father's first bankruptcy, the number that governed his life. Rejected. A cold prickle danced across his skin. He looked at the code scrolling past in the background. It wasn't his work. It was a layer of silk wrapped around a cage of thorns. He saw a name in the metadata, a signature left in the margins of the code like a taunt. S. Johnson. Asterisk. The truth hit him like a physical blow, worse than the guard's fist. Sarah. She hadn't just stood by while Julian moved against him. She had provided the tools. She had taken his encryption, his cathedral, and added her own locks. She had been inside his head for months, watching him build the very trap she was now using to crush him. Arthur stared at the screen as the drive began to wipe itself. The files, the years of research, the ethical coding, the soul of the brand, were dissolving into strings of meaningless zeros. He lunged for the keyboard, trying to abort the command, but the system refused to recognize him. It was a locked door with the wrong key, and the key had been melted down. He sat on the weight bench, the cold metal biting through his trousers. He had lost the drive. He had lost the evidence, and he had lost the only person he thought he could trust. The silence of the gym was broken only by the hum of the empty treadmills, a relentless, mechanical sound that seemed to say, "You are obsolete. You are obsolete." The door to the gym creaked open. Arthur didn't look up. He knew the sound of those boots. Sarah Johnson walked in, her heels clicking with a predatory rhythm on the rubber flooring. She didn't look like a CEO in this light. She looked like a ghost. She leaned against the mirror, her reflection stretching into an infinite loop of cold, green eyes. "Arthur," she said, her voice a low, breathy purr that forced him to look at her. "You look tired. You're vibrating at a very high frequency. It's not healthy." "You re-encrypted the drive," Arthur said, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the cold air. "Why?" Sarah straightened, moving into his personal space. She reached out and touched his forearm, her fingers warm through the wool of his suit. "Because the world doesn't want a cathedral, Arthur. They want a mall. They want fast, cheap, and easy. Your ethics, they're an efficiency bottleneck. They're a weight around the firm's neck." She smiled, a slow, terrifying expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm doing this for the legacy. For your legacy. even if you aren't around to see it. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. I've sent out a memo, by the way. Mental exhaustion. It's a very kind way to say you've lost your mind. Don't make me make it worse. She left, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid. Arthur was alone in the cold, surrounded by the whirring of machines and the scent of his own fear. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He had to get out. He had to find a way to fight back, even if he was fighting a ghost. He grabbed his briefcase, the weight of it, a small comfort. He wouldn't go home. He wouldn't disappear. He made his way back to the service elevator, but the doors were stuck. A red light pulsed above the frame, a lockdown. He was trapped on the 4th floor. He looked at the ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was small, slick with grease, and smelled of old copper. He dragged a chair over, his movements stiff. He climbed up, the metal groaning under his weight. He unscrewed the grate with a coin, the screws falling onto the rubber floor with a tiny, metallic ring. He pulled himself into the duct, the galvanized steel scraping against his suit. The crawl space was narrow, the air thick with dust that tasted like scorched metal. He moved on his hands and knees, the rhythmic thumping of his heart echoing in the confined space. He could hear voices through the vents, the hushed whispers of the people who had replaced him. He moved toward the central console, his fingers hovering over the keys. He knew this system. He had helped design the architecture. He began to type, his movements becoming fluid again. He wasn't building a cathedral now. He was building a fire. He felt a presence behind him. He turned, his hand reaching for the heavy briefcase. It was Michael Davis, the IT assistant. He was wearing a faded hoodie, his posture slumped as if the weight of the building was on his shoulders. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked at the floor. "I saw you on the feed," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Vance. They're looking for you everywhere." "I need your help, Michael," Arthur said, stepping closer. "The Horizon Project. It's not what I built. They've turned it into something predatory." Michael flinched, his eyes darting toward a bowl of red jelly beans on a nearby desk. He reached out and knocked the bowl over, the red candies spilling across the floor like drops of blood. "I can't. Sarah. She knows everything. She sees everything." "She doesn't see you, Michael. She treats you like furniture. That's your power." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bag of green grapes he'd grabbed from the gym. He held them out. "Help me stop them." Michael looked at the grapes, then at Arthur. He took the bag, his fingers trembling. "The protocol is red. They've mapped your biometrics. If you step out of this room, the alarms will trigger." "Then we change the map," Arthur said. For the next hour, they worked in the blue-lit silence. Michael's fingers moved with a speed that Arthur couldn't match, bypassing firewalls and rerouting security feeds. They were a strange pair, the fallen titan and the invisible boy, working to dismantle a lie. "It's done," Michael said, finally looking Arthur in the eye. "I've ghosted your ID. You're a shadow in the system now. But you only have an hour before the manual sweep." "That's all I need," Arthur said. He turned to leave, but stopped. "Why are you helping me, Michael?" Michael looked back at the spilled red candies. "Because you're the only one who ever noticed I don't eat the red ones." Arthur climbed back into the vents, the cold steel feeling less like a cage and more like a path. He reached the executive hallway, the carpet so thick it swallowed his footsteps. He could see the boardroom at the end of the hall, the mahogany doors closed. He heard a sound behind him, the click of a flashlight. "Mr. Vance?" It was Julian. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, the light from his flashlight cutting through the dimness. He wasn't smiling now. He looked terrified. "Julian," Arthur said, stepping out of the shadows. "You're tapping the door frames again, 4 times. You're worried the ceiling is going to fall in." Julian's face went pale. "You shouldn't be here, Arthur. The board? They've already made their decision." "They made a decision based on a lie, Julian. You're a mimic. You have no soul of your own. You're just wearing my clothes." Julian lunged, swinging the heavy flashlight like a club. Arthur ducked, the air from the swing whistling past his ear. They collided, a desperate, silent struggle on the plush carpet. Julian was younger, stronger, but he was hollow. Arthur fought with the weight of 30 years of integrity. He pinned Julian against a server rack, his forearm pressed against the boy's throat. "The Horizon Project is a trap, Julian, and you're the bait." Arthur pulled the master override chip Michael had given him and slammed it into the boardroom's biometric lock. The heavy doors swung open with a hiss of pressurized air. Subverted beat 3.5. Arthur burst into the room, his suit torn, his face bruised. The board members sat around the mahogany table, their faces reflected in the high-gloss surface. Sarah stood at the head of the table, a crystal glass of blue liquid in her hand. "Stop!" Arthur shouted, his voice echoing in the sterile silence. The code Julian presented. It's illegal. It's designed to harvest private data. It will destroy the firm's reputation. He threw the laptop onto the table, the screen showing the predatory strings of code he and Michael had uncovered. "Look at it. This isn't branding. This is theft." The board members didn't move. They didn't gasp. They didn't even look at the screen. Robert Thompson, the oldest member, sat with his eyes tracking the ceiling tiles, his lips moving in a silent count. "We know, Arthur," Robert said, finally looking down. 144 tiles. This room is perfectly square." Arthur froze. You know?" Sarah stepped forward, her silk dress shimmering in the ozone-heavy air. "Of course we know, Arthur. We asked for it." The board members began to nod, a rhythmic, terrifying movement. "The ethical safeguards were too expensive," one of them said. "They limited the growth potential." "Julian's version, it's lean," another added. "It prioritizes the bottom line. That's what the shareholders want." Arthur looked around the room, at the faces of the people he had worked with for decades. They weren't being deceived. They were the architects. They didn't care about the soul of the brand. They only cared about the margin. "But the privacy laws, the lawsuits," Arthur stammered. "We've factored those in," Sarah said, her voice cold and triumphant. "A cost of doing business. You were always so focused on the cathedral, Arthur. You forgot that people just want a place to shop." She signaled to the corners of the room. 4 security guards stepped out of the shadows, their boots heavy on the carpet. They didn't look like the mercenaries from the lobby. They were the firm's own men, the ones Arthur had hired. "Remove him," Sarah said softly. "He's trespassing." Arthur stood paralyzed as the guards took his arms. He looked at the board, but they had already turned back to their glasses of blue liquid. He was a ghost in the room, a remnant of a world that no longer existed. He had fought to save a kingdom that had already been sold for scrap. They dragged him toward the door. He didn't struggle this time. The weight of the betrayal was too heavy. He had lost, not because he wasn't smart enough, but because he was the only one playing by the rules. As they reached the elevators, Arthur felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a look of pity. "You're right, Sarah," he said, his voice calm now, the structural integrity returning. "The world doesn't want a cathedral. But a mall needs a foundation too. And you forgot to check the pilings." He reached into his pocket and pressed a single button on a small, black remote, the one Michael had helped him build in the server room. "What did you do?" Sarah asked, her expression shifting from pity to suspicion. "I didn't change the code, Sarah. I just added a signature, a stylistic nuance that only a rival firm would recognize. A firm I consulted for 10 years ago. They own the copyright to the core architecture Julian borrowed." He smiled, a slow, measured expression. "The moment you launch this project, you'll be hit with a lawsuit that will bankrupt the firm in 48 hours. Unless, of course, you have someone who can fix it." The silence in the hallway was absolute. Sarah's face turned the color of the marble floor. "What do you want?" she hissed. "A quiet exit," Arthur said. "A severance package that reflects my contribution, and a signed NDA that says I was never here." 10 minutes later, Arthur stood on the Michigan Avenue sidewalk. The wind was still cold, the exhaust still thick, but the air felt easier to breathe. He held a single envelope in his hand, the price of his silence. He looked up at the glass tower. It looked smaller now, less like a cathedral and more like a cage. He saw Julian through the window, tapping the doorframe, his face pressed against the glass. The boy would spend the rest of his life trying to maintain a perfection he didn't understand. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out his gold watch, the one the firm had given him for his 25th anniversary. He looked at it for a moment, then dropped it into a public trash bin. The metallic clink was the most satisfying sound he'd heard all day. He turned and walked into the crowd, his steps rhythmic and steady. He wasn't a titan anymore. He wasn't a CEO. He was just a man in a white shirt, walking into a new future. He reached the corner and stopped. He pulled a small bag of green grapes from his pocket and popped one into his mouth. It was sweet, cold, and real. The Chicago wind caught his coat, but he didn't pull it tighter. He just kept walking, leaving the ghost of Arthur Vance behind in the marble and glass, while the man himself finally went home.